Today on Hack You, where we're joined by Dr. Rupy Aujla, NHS doctor, best-selling author, and founder of Doctor's Kitchen. Rupy has built a global following by showing how food and lifestyle can be powerful tools for prevention and performance. From clinical practice to podcasts, books, and media, he's been one of the leading voices making nutrition science both accessible and actionable. But this conversation goes deeper. We'll explore not just the basics of eating, but how food, lifestyle, and cutting-edge science intersect with health optimization and longevity. From Mediterranean diet to nutrigenomics, brain health, and the role of food in tackling inflammation. I particularly enjoyed hearing about fasting windows, and that they're actually much shorter than we might think, about having food before going to bed and its impact on sleep quality, about nature's real GLP-1 that nobody even speaks about, and that you actually should have 30 grams a day of it, and probiotics that are actually overhyped. And for most people, they don't even make the top 50 list of things to do. Dr. Rupy Aujla, welcome to Hack You Podcast.
Thanks, man. I'm excited to get into this.
Love it. Amazing. Listen, super excited to have you on. Just for the people who get to know you more now in detail, the backstory is from NHS GP to Doctor's Kitchen founder. Can you give us a little bit about your background and how you got where you are today?
Yeah, sure. So I've been working in the NHS for over 15 years. I trained in A&E, general practice. I worked at an ITU for a bit, but my health journey actually started when I just qualified as a junior doctor. So like a couple of months into the role, I started suffering from a heart condition called atrial fibrillation. And I'll give you the short story, which is basically I was going to have a procedure called an ablation. And this was definitely, 100% on what I was thinking at the time. I'd got loads of advice from other medics and some of the world's best cardiologists. But it was actually my mum who convinced me to really think about my diet and lifestyle before I entertained something quite serious. And through just diving into the research and doing some really simple stuff with him, it wasn't like anything too fancy. I changed up my diet. I started doing yoga, meditation, breath work, all the stuff that's super popular today. I dove into the evidence in a big way, and I reversed my own cardiac condition. And so that led me with this sort of question: why wasn't I taught this kind of stuff at medical school? And how deep does the rabbit hole go? What else can we do with simple tools that we have at our disposal? Can it improve metabolic health? Can it improve fatigue? Can it improve things like depression? Can it prevent or at least reduce the risk of things like neurodegenerative conditions? And lo and behold, there's a whole bunch of things that we can do with food and lifestyle medicine. And I started sharing recipes with patients. I would get super late in clinic. I'd get known as the guy that would talk to their patients about nutrition. And so I started a blog whilst I was working in A&E in Australia, Sydney, this was like 10 years ago now, honestly, to just like improve the efficiency of my clinic, because I was just constantly writing down recipes for everyone. And so I thought I'd just put it on a blog, give people the URL. And that led to the Instagram, and then I got a book deal, and then the rest is sort of history. So podcast came next, BBC shows, 5 cookbooks now, the Doctor's Kitchen app, which is like an app where you can find recipes using the latest evidence base, and you can filter according to your health goal, whether that's skin health or brain health or menopausal health. And yeah, all the way to this position where I'm sat down with you virtually.
My question is, when I hear this a lot, that nutrition is just not part of the GP's education, and right now in the US, obviously they're making this mandatory for nutrition to be part of it. Why do you think there's such a lack? Why does education not make it more important?
Yeah, I think it's a really complicated question, but a good one. I think we're just very behind when it comes to traditional models of medicine and actually what generates health. And I think it's because perhaps we've come from an era where drugs and things like antimicrobials, anti-infective agents were just so incredibly powerful, increasing lifespan and health span. That we've sort of put them on a pedestal and forgotten about the basics of what it means to be healthy. And within the medical curricula, it's just so jam-packed with other specialties and the teachings about pathology and all the things that are super, super important, that there wasn't really an appreciation for the importance of nutrition. And I think when you fast forward to today, where we have a modern health environment that is over reliant on drugs. We have something called polypharmacy, which is a well-known phenomena of over-prescribing and the interactions of all these different different medications, many of which we don't actually fully appreciate because we're sort of siloed in our medical practices. Gastro doesn't necessarily always talk to the respiratory physician, doesn't speak to the general practitioner. That I think we've sort of lost the appreciation of like just general health. And I think the two can sit together, which is why I did my master's in nutritional medicine, to get a grasp of what it means to be a nutritionist and to appreciate dietetics in the grander scheme of things, and also balance the use of evidence-based medicine and epidemiology and all those sort of real core cornerstones of nutrition and well-being, and also appreciate the N of one medicine, which I think is what we're sort of veering towards more today, like personalized medicine. Actually, is a statin that's part of a guideline really reflective of the optimum journey for everyone, as an example. So that sort of thing, I think, is in its infancy right now, but it's definitely gaining a lot of attention. And I think it's also because a lot of medics are getting sick themselves at an earlier age. I'm 40 now, and I've got colleagues that are pre-diabetic and type 2 diabetic. People who have had IBD, and that they know what the score is. You're going to be on these drugs. You're going to be these drugs for life. Like, there's got to be another path. And so, as the patient population actually sort of seeps into medics themselves, I think we're all asking the same questions and looking for the same answers.
I think some of the questions. So, the idea of HackU was how to optimize yourself, your well-being, your physical, your mental capabilities. And this is episode 15, and we're now at the point where we discussed steroids, stem cells, peptides. We discussed everything. We never talked about food. And food is something that is actually the baseline, the foundation of everything that we do. So before we dive in at food as a medicine, which I think is one of the strongest statements because that's where everything starts, when we talk about food from an optimization perspective, one of the things that when preparing for this episode that I liked most about you, that you were not just saying, hey, stop all the pharmaceuticals, just do food. You said, no. You need to combine them if you want to get the most out of it. So when we're talking about from an optimization perspective, can you just give the audience basic like 5 ingredients or foods that you would say, hey, if you want to feel better every day from an energy perspective, this is what I would start with, just so an audience understands when you mean food, what you mean by that.
Yeah, definitely, man. And I would say it's really categories of food rather than specific foods. Because I think if I was to just dive into like 5 specific foods, that's going to be at the detriment of the audience because that's quite restrictive, especially if you're shedding away everything else. So let's talk a bit about categories of food. The first thing, I think it's actually removal of what's not serving you and potentially harming you. And I think everyone now has really grasped this idea of ultra-processed food. Even the specifics of what ultra-processed food actually mean is sort of debated, but I'm going to put my academic hat to one side here and just talk about the general themes of what is a processed food: additives, emulsifiers that are there really to serve a functional benefit to the actual structure of the food rather than a health functional benefit to the individual user. These are the things that we want to avoid, generally in packets, generally in boxes, and generally requiring a label. We want to optimize for whole unprocessed food as much as possible. This is sort of like principle number 1, eat whole. But if we're diving into categories of food within that, I would say the first thing is optimizing protein. And this is something that I've actually come a long journey along myself. So I used to think that we all consume enough protein. We don't need to concern ourselves with protein. It's overhyped, it's overmarketed, which it is. But protein from good unprocessed whole sources and good quality protein is essential. It is the most important macronutrient. Without anything else, we could just survive if we just had protein. Not that we want to opt that way. We don't want to just focus on only having protein, but we could survive on just protein. And that's because proteins are just so foundational to everything: our immune cells, our bones, our hormones, so many elements that people forget about when they think about protein. Most people just think about muscle,
Hmm.
but 75% of the proteins that you're consuming and recycling as a result of the activity of your liver and other things is all really down to the sort of foundation level for the different physiological processes that we have. So protein, I think, number one is the thing to optimize, and you want to get those from things like lean meats. You can get it from plant-based sources like nuts and seeds. You can get it from even minimally processed sources, things like tofu and tempeh that I'm actually really big fans of. Beans and legumes, I think, are touted as high protein, but actually, when you dive into them, they're actually more complex carbohydrates and more high fiber types that are really important to get in the diet, but I don't regard them as a good quality source of protein, perhaps with the exception of things like edamame and obviously soy that goes into tofu. But yeah, I think protein is something that everyone needs to know their number on. And like I said, I've gone on a journey with protein. I used to think zero point 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per 24 hours was sufficient to not only prevent deficiency, but enough for our needs. And actually, I think that's way under consuming protein. And so I always tend to tell people to offer a minimum of 1.2, 1.6 if you're active, if you're over the age of 50, if you're postmenopausal. There might be some extra benefits up to 2 grams, but this is where you wade into the murky world of over consuming calories unless you're very, very fastidious about the energy balance. So I think 1.2 is a good base for most people, for everyone. And then 1.6 is what I would aim for. So protein number one.
Yeah, let me jump in on the protein, because in protein,
Yeah.
again, I'm happy to add color to everything you're saying, just from a
Yeah.
personal perspective, but also from the audience perspective, where on the protein side of things, there's a lot of research that came out recently. 10 years ago, I was a professional athlete. You were told that your body cannot absorb more than 25, 30 grams of protein per sitting. Now, there were studies out, you can take 100 grams of protein in one sitting, and actually, from an efficacy perspective, it's even higher. Then there were studies, you need to take protein around workouts. Now there are studies out, it doesn't matter what time of the day you take it, as long as you take it. So some of the things that you've learned nowadays that maybe 5-10 years ago were different, that you want to share in regards to protein.
Yeah, so I think number one is the amount, and the amount that we all need, and we could all do with having a bit more. The studies looking at consumption of protein shows that on average, people consume more than what is currently deemed the minimum threshold, but the quality of that protein is really variable. It could be coming from, well, a lot of it is coming from processed foods where protein is added. It could be, cereal-based foods, that kind of thing that I don't think is optimal for overall health. The other thing is, in terms of the optimum timing for protein, there was a suggestion that you had this anabolic window, and it was like, 60 to 120 minutes after working out, strenuous exercise. Actually, it's more like it's a lot longer. It's like 24 hours. You still have this muscle protein synthesis signal that is like constantly on, or for a prolonged period of time after the stimulus of exercise. So I would say you don't need to worry too much about protein timing. It's more about getting enough protein in 24 hours, which is why I'm a really big fan of getting protein at breakfast, because it's that opportunity of protein in your meal that is often lost with most breakfast items. Most breakfast items are quite low protein.
Yeah.
If you think about a typical cereal, a muffin or whatever it might be, you're getting like 15 to 20 grams.
At best,
So
yeah.
it's no wonder 11 a.m. comes around and you feel hungry and you overconsume and you start grabbing snacks and all the rest of it. It's because we all have a threshold for protein that we need to meet. Otherwise, which your brain literally tells you that you're still hungry and you need to go out and get food. And the reason why is it's almost like an evolutionary preserved mechanism to ensure that we get enough protein, because, like I said earlier, it's just so important for overall health and our physiology.
In terms of front loading the protein in the morning, do you see studies that say that your satiation is higher when you start with protein in the morning? Is that something that gets you through the day easier from a diet perspective?
Yeah, so there's a number of different studies showing that you tend to consume less calories if you have a high protein meal to start off your day. There's also a really interesting one looking, I think it was a Chinese study where they gave them eggs in the morning instead of like a cereal based breakfast, I believe it was, and it had like at least 15 grams more protein. They found that they had like steadier energy levels and less sort of crashes in the day. Um, and so there's a lot of research to suggest that having that protein in the morning is good from like an energy point of view and just a general focus point of view. But I think if you think about it pragmatically, it's just that opportunity to ensure that you're hitting your protein target. Otherwise, you're relying on lunch and dinner and snacks to hit that higher amount, which for a lot of people is quite hard. I mean, my personal target is 140 grams every day. If I don't get a good 30 grams in the morning, then I'm really like chasing my tail for the rest of the day. And just from an end of one experience, focus, energy, lack of cravings, these are all things that we see in the literature, but also in my personal experience as well. So I'm a big fan of breakfast protein.
In terms of the ultra processed foods that you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of probably noise out there that in terms of the health degrading, fertility levels degrading, testosterone levels degrading, is because we consume more and more of those kind of foods. Is that again from just because is that are the tails, is this N of ones, or do we have now the data that we know that one of the reasons why we need more supplementation because we eat less whole foods is because the food that we consume is just not so nutritious?
I think, I mean, most ultra processed food tends to be low in fiber, low in protein, unless it's fortified, lacking in nutrients, again, unless it's fortified. Plus, you don't get the plethora of what I was going to speak about in a second of the polyphenols and the different plant chemicals that you find in healthy whole foods, whether they're cooked or fresh or eaten raw. And I think it's the absence of those that leads to detriments in our health and well-being, as well as the metabolic consequences of over-consuming hyperpalatable carbohydrate-rich foods as well. That puts us at higher risk of things like type 2 diabetes, obesity, and also dementia as it's coming to light. So I think that's certainly part of the puzzle. And I think the other thing is when you're consuming those kind of foods and you're not getting the second thing that I'll talk about in a second, which is good quality fats. These can also have an impact on things like fertility levels. I mean, fertility is a very complicated and multifactorial area. I had Professor Schwan on my podcast a couple of years ago who was sounding the alarm of contaminants and microplastics and these hormone disrupting effects of commonly found chemicals in our food system, as well as clothing system, all the rest of it. That really did make me think of that as an extra factor in the declining fertility rates, as well, on top of an increase in the rate of metabolic disease and obesity, and mental health issues as well, which all can have an impact on your hormones that can impact fertility. So it's a really difficult one, but I don't doubt that UPF foods are having an impact.
Yeah, this is just because it adds, it's interesting. The more guests I have on the show, the more guests tell us what impacts fertility from a food perspective. Now we had Dr. Dave Rabin, he's talked about it's a mental, 50% is mental. And I think if I'm not mistaken, one of your previous podcasts, one of your guests said the devices, the exposure to devices technology is so high for women that they can't focus on actually on reproduction because they're so occupied with technology. So it seems like the whole world is now, the modern world is doing anything it can to lower reproduction. And so we need to find a way to fight that, obviously, and protect.
The modern brain, the modern ovaries, the modern testes are very, very different to like 50 years ago. And I think, it can be down to so many different factors. But like you said, stress, digital devices, the connection that we have with the other sex, these are all things that interplay in declining fertility rates. But fats is very important. So
let's go back to the five. Let's go back to the five. We can.
Yeah. So we're number two. We could spend the next couple of hours just talking about categories of foods. But then the next one I would say is fats. So a lot of people have demonized fats because of the high calorific content of them. So nuts and seeds fall into that category. So do things like good quality oils, fatty fish. But I think looking at food through the lens of calories alone, and I'm not discrediting the sort of energy balance issues around like consuming these foods, I think is quite naive, and it really strips away from just how incredible these ingredients are in our diet. Nuts and seeds contain things like zinc, selenium, magnesium. They contain these phytosterols that we know lower our cholesterol. They can have blood pressure lowering effects. I mean, these are real food as medicine elements of our diet. And I think if we just look at them through the lens of energy, we sort of dismiss them as just like fuel. And I want people to reestablish a relationship with nuts and seeds in particular, because they're high fiber, they're high protein, they have all these extra novel compounds. Some star ones, I would say, would be things like flax. So flax has a molecule that I still can't pronounce to this day. It's SDG is what it's abbreviated to. Seco-isosesaresinol diglycoside. I think that's how you pronounce it, but I'm probably going to get
Now you're just
corrected by
showing off.
Google. Yeah, I've had to practice that one, but I mean, it's incredible from an inflammation lowering perspective, and I think that's the other element of fats that people want to explore a bit more as well, because these are like pro resolving factors in the inflammation cascade. So these are all things that can contribute to us balancing inflammation, which is really, really important in the modern world as well. So fats, I'm a really big fan of, but getting them from whole sources as much as possible. When you refine them, when you strip away some of these compounds, like that's, when you have like deep fried items and, things taken up to super high temperatures, when you disrupt those bonds, that's where you can have potentially inflammation producing issues. But when you're eating them in the whole form, they're fantastic. A big call out for things like omega-3. So a lot of people are under consuming omega-3 long chain fatty acids in their diet, EPA and DHA. And we primarily get these from fatty fish. So things like sardines, anchovies, herring, mackerel. Like I have these in my diet all the time, but I still supplement with fish oil because it's still very hard for me to get there's something called the omega-3 index. I'm sure your audience will have come across this if they're sort of like into health optimization.
Absolutely.
But you want to try and get your omega-3 index above 8%. It's a blood spot. You can do it on like a piece of card, and you send it off, and they look at your red blood cells, and they look at the amount of omega-3 attached to that. And so, yeah, I take omega-3 fish oils, but I definitely get a lot of fats in my diet from healthy whole sources.
In terms of fats, I think there's a couple of things. That, number one is the importance from a brain, brain capability and just memory. And the second one is what people don't understand is you actually need fat to burn fat also. Like there's a lot of diets out there who actually increase omega-3 intake to increase the fat burning aspect. So I think there's a misconception where it used to be fat is bad and you get fat from fat. And I think hopefully people get more educated around that and understand that better.
Yeah. I mean, like our body is a fat producing machine because it's an incredibly useful energy form. So when you overconsume simple carbohydrates or just overconsume energy in general, your liver is tasked with packaging that, and it will create fats, and it will push that into the bloodstream, and then you'll keep that in various parts in your body. If you're lucky, you'll get it in your subcutaneous tissue where it's a little bit less active. If you're unlucky, like you come from a South Asian background like myself, or an African background like a lot of my colleagues, you may be predisposed to putting it around your viscera, i.e. around your organs, and that's metabolically active fat as well. So that can, again, put you at risk of cardiovascular disease and metabolic health issues and all the rest of it. So you want to be really careful about energy balance, but also this idea of like, oh, if you consume fat, you're going to get fat. It's not entirely true. It really depends on the quality of those fats and how much you're consuming.
Before we move on from fats, in regards to nuts, there's a lot of conversation around molds and nuts and just, how should you cleanse? What's the best way to consume nuts? Can you just tell the audience what's the right way to do it?
Yeah, so it comes down to a few things. First off, I would say you want to try and ensure you're getting it from a clean source as much as possible. So I'm very privileged and lucky that I can afford to make the choice to go organic where possible, and I try and opt for producers that I know are producing these kind of products in clean environments. So I tend not to get it from places where there's less transparency. And in an ideal world, honestly, like food producers would test their products in the same way I look for lab tested supplements to make sure that they are low or free from heavy metals. I think it's impossible to be completely free of metals and other contaminants, unfortunately, in today's day and age. But I want to be looking for sources where they're low. The other thing, and these are more traditional methods that I've talked about in my first book, Doctor's Kitchen, and subsequent books, is the sort of traditional processes to reduce anti-nutrients they're described as or called by soaking and part germinating your nuts. So if you get some raw almonds, for example, sometimes there could be raw almonds you bought off like Amazon or Temu or whatever, and they've been sitting in a shelf for like years, collecting dust in a weird warm environment, and you want to be careful of mold and stuff. So one way is to ensure that you're getting fresh raw almonds. That's one way. But then the second step after that is to soak them overnight. And then you want to dry them completely and then allow them to quote unquote germinate or slightly sprout. That way, you're actually increasing the bioavailability of some of these nutrients in almonds, and you're reducing things like anti-nutrients, so phytates, tannins. There are a number of other ones like lectins as well that you find in legumes. So it just makes it a lot more easier to digest for folks. But a lot of people don't have time, myself included. So
when you're on the run,
I will opt for like raw ones or like low. Like if you're worried about mold, you can lightly roast them. Actually, something my mum always tells me to do. You got to throw walnuts into the pan and just gently roast them, just to make sure you're getting rid of any sort of like mold, as well as washing them and cleaning them and that kind of stuff. So that's one way in which you can reduce your risk for sure.
Awesome. Okay, so we got protein, we got the fat.
Yeah. The other one I would call out are greens. So I'm a real big fan of getting greens at every mealtime. I think they're such an important part of the diet that's missing in a lot of people's day to day. And when I say greens, I mean specifically the category of cruciferous vegetables. And cruciferous vegetables, they come in all sorts of forms. Like most people think of cruciferous vegetables as broccoli, which it is. But there's cauliflower, there's rocket or arugula for our American friends. Even things like turnips. They're from the brassica family. Maca is a type of brassica. That's why it's got almost like a bitter taste. And then you can get like sprouts of their seeds. So broccoli sprouts are just like phenomenal. You can buy them in supplemental form, or you can make them yourself really cheaply. And I think that's one way that actually, if you think about a Venn diagram of like trying to make food as accessible as possible, and then like the highest quality, most nutrient food, generally like they don't intersect. It's like if you think about meat, you got grass-fed and grass-finished beef that is sustainably farmed on a regenerative plant like area where the meat has been massaged and blah 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 blah. And then on the other side, you've got like livestock in like factory farming conditions. It's very hard to actually get the intersection. Sprouts are the exception there because they are exceptionally cheap, super easy to grow, and they're super, super nutrient dense. So you can make broccoli sprouts for literally pennies with a simple sprouting machine at home, or even without a sprouter, just using like a glass and just adding your seeds to that. And over 3 or 4 days, you can create something that has higher amounts of these protective chemicals that you find in broccoli, but up to 50 times in a broccoli sprout. There's a really interesting study actually where they gave folks 30 grams, like a handful of broccoli sprouts every day. I believe it was for like 4 weeks. And they measured their inflammation markers, and it significantly reduced CRP and TNF alpha by 59% after like 4 weeks. So these are powerful anti-inflammatory. This is why I use the term food as medicine, because these are powerful anti-inflammatory ingredients that we should all be aware of and we should be incorporating more into our day-to-day. So greens for the win. And I have a little saying, it's like, greens at every meal. I try even at breakfast time, like if I'm having leftovers, greens on the side. For lunch today, I made myself like a quick scramble with tofu, onions, some chili oil, and on the side I had some plantain for my carbs, and then I had some watercress on the side. Like that, it's a very simple meal for me. I've got my protein, I've got my fiber, and I've got my greens. So yeah, it's super, super important.
When it comes to greens, there's the question is: are we talking about cooked, raw? Because a lot of people who, when they consume raw vegetable, raw greens, they have an upset stomach afterwards. There's a reaction there. Is that
Yeah.
reaction because you don't consume enough and you actually the body signals you need more of it, so you get used to it, or is there something else there?
I think depending on the individual, they can be sensitive to maybe the pesticides that haven't been washed properly, the fiber, and some of the chemicals, particularly in cruciferous vegetables, can be quite bitter. And when you lightly cook them, it reduces those slightly as well. It makes them slightly digestible. So I'd say you want to go for a middle ground. I personally go for a mixture of raw and cooked. The reason why is because when you're eating them raw, you're getting a higher amount of vitamin C. When you cook them, your vitamin C goes down, but then the availability of some of the other nutrients, things like sulforaphane or even glucosinolates and indole 3 carbinol, all these sort of anti-inflammatory chemicals, they actually increase somewhat as well, which is why if you've ever cooked a piece of broccoli, it kind of looks gray, limp when it's raw. And then when you steam it, it suddenly goes this like dark green, vibrant color.
Yeah.
Like that's actually a signal that some of those nutrients are slightly more available. So I personally go for a mix, but depending on how much people already consume in the diet, you might want to go slow. And that actually brings me on to the fourth one, which is fiber. And fiber as a category, people think, okay, all brand cereal, or they might think oat bran, or, these sort of like high fiber marketed boxes. But fiber comes in so many different forms. The best sources would be whole grains, beans, legumes. But you can also get it from starchy vegetables. You can get it from root vegetables. You can get it from potatoes with the skins on. Whole vegetables generally have a lot of fiber, but the highest fiber amounts you'll find in legumes. But if you are sensitive, or you've already been, or you're on a low fiber diet, or you've actually been low carb for a long time and you're transitioning to getting more fiber in your diet, you want to go really, really slow. And sometimes it can be as slow as having a tablespoon of cooked legumes, like cooked lentils or cooked beans, just once a day, and then titrating it upwards, because it's sort of like your microbes, which are, I'm sure you've had someone on the podcast talking about the microbiota already, but as like a quick refresher for folks, is your microbiota is the population of bacteria, but also viruses, nematodes, fungi that live all over your body, but largely concentrated in the large intestine. And when you feed yourself, you're actually feeding your microbes in addition. And they are incredible workers for you. They reduce inflammation. They keep your blood sugars nice and steady. They keep you satiated. They improve your mood, and they also protect their atmosphere. They build the mucin layer. They keep your gut nice and tight, so it's not leaky, and it prevents it from exaggerated immune responses that can lead to inflammation. So they're doing a lot of stuff for us. But if they're not used to having fiber, and you suddenly throw fiber at them, they're going to tell you about it, and they're not going to react in a way you want. It's almost like, if you've not been to the gym for 8 weeks and suddenly you start deadlifting what you were doing like 8 weeks ago, you're going to injure yourself. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. So you got to titrate it up.
Quick one on fiber and legumes. One of the first books that kind of opened up my eye to from a diet perspective was Tim Ferriss's 4 Hour Body. And part of that was when it comes to fiber, he was like recommending low fiber with low glycemic index in terms of just like you said, beans or lentils. Is that still something that's 15 years ago? Is that still something, is that still the golden rule? Like if you go for something, you should go for something with a low glycemic index, or do we now know more?
So the glycemic index and glycemic loading are interesting concepts, and I don't disagree with them, but I don't think it's fully reflective of how we tend to consume food. So this, just for folks, is like an index that essentially gives you a perspective into the glucose response, the blood sugar response that you're going to have when you consume said food alone. And like 100 is like table sugar, and then other underneath that you've got various items. It could be certain types of fruits, mango, white potato, all these different breads, all these different foods. But we don't tend to consume these foods alone. We tend to consume them in a mixed meal. So I think there's a risk of over-interpreting the glycemic index and the glycemic load. That being said, I think what it generally says to folks is steer clear of refined products, so refined white rice, for example, or refined potato, French fries, that kind of stuff, and stick to the whole foods that are more complex, that have complicated carbohydrates, polysaccharides, and are less likely to cause that blood sugar spiking. When you consume foods together, like with greens and with different fiber sorts and protein, you're going to be mitigating against that blood sugar spiking, which most people would want to avoid. There is controversy over this, though. A lot of people don't think that we should be worried about blood sugar spikes in non-diabetics. I disagree. I think we should be. I don't think we should be over-interpreting CGM data, so continuous glucose monitoring data. But I think it's like one of those extra sort of dials to put into your dashboard where you've got everything else there as well, like your apolipoprotein B, your weight, your energy, subjective energy levels, your sleep score. It just goes into the dashboard and becomes part of your overall strategy rather than just the one dial that you're like your North Star metric. I don't think we need to look at it in that respect.
Is there a rule of thumb from fiber from how many grams per day or per kilogram perspective, like with protein?
Yeah, so there is a way in which you can measure based on your weight, your fiber requirements. I would say you want to try and aim for a minimum of 30 grams per day. But again, it really depends on whether you're coming from a low fiber diet already. I personally kind of smash through that most days, and that's a nice sort of middle ground for me. But I think the other thing, which I want to get across to folks, Vadim, is people should become experts of their own health, and they should really become more intuitive about what really works for them. So whilst I'm saying, look, you want to get your greens in, you want to get your fiber in, you want to get your protein in, like don't take everything I say as gospel. Say it as like the general rules of the game. But then like you've got to annotate that game for yourself. So if you're not working well with fiber, or you're finding that it's like giving you like way too much gas and you've tried to titrate it and it's just not working for you, then don't go for those. Try something else. Try different vegetables. Try different ingredients that actually work better with your system, because we're all unique. And I think that's the biggest takeaway that.
So this is important for people to understand. When you can't, or you have a reaction to it, do you titrate down, or do you start looking for solutions like adding prebiotics or other things to, or pharmaceuticals if need be, to it, to get you to the point where you can actually intake that? So your position is, listen to your body, and if it's too much or the reaction's not there, or is there moments where you're like, no, your body needs it, you just, because like you said, I haven't been in the gym for 8 weeks, so you can't deadlift right away, where you actually have to just work it up over time?
Yeah, I would say before you add anything else into the mix, whether it's prebiotics, probiotics, a supplement regime, digestive enzymes, any of that kind of stuff, where you almost overcomplicate the matter, you want to just start with the basics, titrate down, go very slow. If you go from like 1 tablespoon of cooked beans to a can every single day, or a jar every single day, like too quickly, you might need to titrate it back down again and just start again, rather than starting adding. It's almost like, if I had a patient come into my office and I put them on a cholesterol lowering regime, and we started off with just one drug, and I gave them the drug, and it wasn't working. I wouldn't suddenly just start adding another drug. I wouldn't start adding a third drug if it wasn't working thereafter. I would actually look holistically at all the other things before we start adding more things to overcomplicate the matter. Let's look at your eating regime. Let's look at your wake regime. Let's look at your exercise regime. What are other things that could be pushing up your cholesterol? Is a statin the best lipid lowering therapy to start off with? Like, you always want to bring it back down to basics before you start adding extra things into your regime.
Awesome. Do we have one left in your top 5?
Yeah, we've got one left. So what have I talked about so far? We talked about fats, we talked about protein, greens, fiber. I think the other thing, and this is a bit of a curveball, is actually when not to eat. So
When not
I'm a
to
big
eat.
fan. When to actually not eat. Because our body has evolved to withstand periods of not consuming food. And a phenomena within our modern environment is actually the inexcusability of being hungry. Like, it's no longer acceptable to be hungry. Like, if you're hungry and it's 10 p.m., you can order something in, you can go out and grab some food, you can grab a snack. Whereas in the environment which our physiology has evolved, like over millennia, that just wasn't an option. And we've actually got systems that have enabled us to adapt to not consuming food. And actually, that's quite favorable for us as well. So we're metabolically adapted to not consuming food for large periods of time. So whilst I'm not a fan of everyone doing 24 or 48-hour long fasts, I am a big fan of maintaining periods of time where you eat and you do not eat. And I think, as a general rule of thumb, people should entertain an 11 to 12-hour fasting window every single day. For some people, they might want to titrate it up because they like how they feel with 16 hours of fasting. Some people might want to titrate it down because they get a bit of gastritis, or they can't tolerate it. The concentration's all over the shop. I would say, but 11 to 12 hours for most people is a really, really good place to be. And it sounds a bit, weird, considering that I'm talking about food and actually how to use food as medicine, but you can actually use fasting as medicine as well. Some really interesting results. I've had Walter Longo and Sachin Panda on the Doctor's Kitchen podcast a couple of times now. Some really interesting research looking at not only longevity benefits, which is slightly controversial, but the main benefits I'm looking at are the metabolic adaptations. Mm-hmm. This idea of being metabolically flexible, where you can fuel yourself on carbohydrates, but also efficiently switch to fueling yourself to be predominant, or not predominantly, but like a larger proportion coming from fats as well. And fasting, or this intermittent time restricted eating, is actually something that can improve that as well. So I think it's a really good tool for people to dip their toe into.
I have a lot of follow-up questions on fasting, because it's been
go for it.
one of the topics for probably the last 5-6 years. I've tried 36-hour fasting every Mondays and Tuesdays, then 72-hour fastings every quarter. 16 and 8 obviously been stable, but if I look back over the last 2-3 years, the more and more feedback is actually it's probably 14 hours is probably the sweet spot for men, and women is might be even closer to 12, 10 to 12, and that kind of put me in a position okay, if that's the case, then when should I probably start to fast? And my idea was then, okay, if I fast before going to bed, I would increase or lower the insulin spikes. I would increase my growth hormone release. I would obviously recover better and grow. And obviously, if you want to, from an audience perspective, wants to be in better shape and all that kind of things. So that was somewhere where I landed in today. Is that based on your research and knowledge, which you agree with? So are we talking about 10 to 12 hours for women, 12 to 14 for men, and it's better to not eat in the evening than in the morning?
I think it depends on the individual. I think we have to be intuitive about this. So I don't like fasting in the evening because I find it harder for me to go to sleep. I will maintain a 2 to 3 hour window before eating my last meal and going to sleep, but I don't like to be fasted for more than that time when I go to sleep, because I'm sort of hungry and it disrupts. And I've measured it, on my Oura Ring and other sleep trackers. So I personally don't like that. But for some other people, that's like an optimum regime because they like to eat first thing in the morning. I personally delay my breakfast and I have that more at 9:30, 10 a.m. But some people, that's just not convenient for them. So they actually break their fast first thing in the morning, because I prefer training fasted as well. But a lot of people, they prefer to have something before they go and train. So I think it really depends on the individual. And then obviously with women, you have to take into account their cycle. So whether they would even want to entertain a longer fasting window beyond 12 hours, whilst in the latter phase of their menstrual cycle, it really depends on them and what they feel comfortable with. So there, like the issue with fasting and the research around fasting is that there isn't a clear biomarker of success. And this is the real frustrating thing in fasting science. Is like we've got this tool, we know it does some great stuff. People feel better. There seem to be metabolic benefits, but I can't tell you the dose of this medicine to use that's actually going to be appropriate for you, because we just don't have the biomarker of success for everyone. So this is where people need to be really intuitive about how to slot it into their diet. The one thing I would say about fasting that people need to be aware of, particularly if you're going for longer than 24 hours, is just monitor how this impacts your strength and your body composition. There have been some recent studies that came out, I think, in the last couple of years, where they found that people who regularly entertained longer fasts actually lost muscle mass and increased their adiposity, so their fat mass. And that's something you want to avoid, particularly as you get older, because our likelihood and the risk of something called sarcopenia, which is general loss of muscle quality, mass, and strength, increases above the age of 40 onwards. And this is why you really want to build as much muscle as you can during your 30s and 40s and maintain your exercise. But, there's going to be a gradual loss, unfortunately. So, yeah, there's something you just want to be careful of if people are entertaining longer fasts.
I'm glad you mentioned that you prefer to actually eat something because you have a better sleep. And I prefer not to eat because it impacts my sleep, because that personalization approach is so interesting. Literally a week ago, I found out about something called the grilled cheese sandwich approach, where if people who have a hard time falling asleep, who have low sleep scores, eat a grilled sandwich before going to bed, they fall asleep quicker because there's peptides in the cheese that open up from the grilling, and it calms them down because they're less anxious because it's the comfort food. And then the person is like, well, what makes no sense, because insulin spikes. Like, listen, why do you care about insulin spikes when you can't fall asleep in the first place? You eat that and then you have a good sleep. That's the benefit. You're trying to sleep. You're not trying to do anything else. So literally he came out with that, the grilled cheese sandwich, give people before going to bed, and they sleep better. It blew my mind because, again, we're all different.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like this. It's interesting. People ask me about foods to increase sleep, like the ones that have soporific effects, and like there was all this sort of hype around tryptophan foods. But tryptophan you can find in lots of, like, pumpkin seeds, squash, turkey. You probably find it in cheese as well. So it's probably another reason as to why it's got that soporific effect. But it is interesting, and I think this is where you just have to. I think it's very easy to follow other people's routines, whether it's morning routines that you see online and stuff, and they can be great for inspiration, but try it and figure out intuitively whether that's actually success for you. Like, I personally can't mouth tape. My wife does.
Yeah.
She sleeps like an absolute dream, and I wish I could mouth tape, but I just can't because of my nose. And it's impossible for me to do it. So I don't do that, but I do other things. Like, I sleep mask, I listen to white noise, I have my temperature at like a certain amount that's good for me. So there are all these different nuances that you need to fine tune for yourself to find the optimum regime.
Awesome. Let's go back to food. One of the symptoms and syndromes that people talk about is called the leaky gut. And especially people who are also in the health optimization space, but also the ones in terms of in the bodybuilding space, complain a lot about that. Can you maybe a little bit explain what the background is, why people get it, and how you can get rid of it, if at all?
Yeah. So leaky gut isn't really an academic term. It's more of a colloquial term. So if you look up leaky gut, you won't find anything on PubMed. But if you start searching intestinal hyperpermeability, that's sort of the umbrella term for what is colloquially known as leaky gut. So if you think about your digestive tract, you've got this gut barrier, and actually your gut barrier encompasses more than just the wall of your gut where people imagine this sort of leaky gut phenomena occurring. You've got the acid in your stomach. You've got bile that sort of douses food as it comes in. It's got these antimicrobial properties. You've got the microbes themselves that again can sort of attach themselves to food, consume it, metabolize it, and also have antimicrobial properties. Then you've got this mucin layer, which is what is produced in part by your microbes that create this sort of cushion between food and the gut barrier itself. And then within the gut barrier, which is this very like small one cell lining between the interior of your digestive tract, if you imagine like the lumen of your large intestine, and then the bloodstream on the other side, you've got multiple like checkpoints through there as well that food and other products has to get through, or nutrients has to get through before it gets into the bloodstream. When you consume food, you want your gut to be quote unquote leaky. You want some nutrients to be able to go into the bloodstream and then distribute throughout the rest of the body where it can nourish your cells, etc. And this is part of the reason why so many of our immune cells are actually housed in your digestive tract, is because this is like a big gateway for anything that is outside of your body going into your body. So whatever is in your digestive tract is sort of still technically outside of your body because it hasn't crossed through the gut barrier into your bloodstream. So your immune cells are like constantly on guard, monitoring for any microbes that shouldn't be there, any pathogens that shouldn't be there. If you're constantly grazing food, you're constantly leaving your digestive tract to be slightly leaky. So this is another reason why people find themselves with a little bit of mild inflammation, because your immune system is constantly being activated because you're constantly consuming food. So this idea that we should be eating little and often is actually antithetical to the science around the gut microbiota. But there are other things that can lead to a disruption of this gut barrier. There's ultra-processed foods, emulsifiers, and additives commonly found in protein shakes and protein bars, which is probably why you find a lot of bodybuilders in the community complaining of leaky gut, because they're just pounding themselves with a lot of these additives, unfortunately. So clean protein is really what you want to be opting for. Alcohol is another big, well-recognized issue around leaky gut. And then you also have the lack of fiber. So when you're not consuming enough fiber and you're focused on low carb diets and high protein, whatever, you're not giving your microbes the opportunity to create that mucin layer that supports that gut barrier that prevents leaky gut from occurring in the first place. So you have a confluence of all these different things that can lead to the leakiness, which overactivates your immune system. And the issue with leaky gut is that it doesn't just lead to digestive complaints and bloating. Because your gut is so central to overall health, it can manifest in so many different ways. Poor mood, fatigue, skin issues, flare-ups, intolerances, immune activation, autoimmune conditions, a whole host of different things. The issue with leaky gut or intestinal hyperpermeability is that, again, we don't have a very robust marker of whether your gut is leaky or not. There's like a sugar test called the lactulose mannitol test, but it can be really skewed, so it's unreliable. There are other scans that you can do, but they're really involved, and actually there's like an old, I think it's called a LED conal focus. I can't even say the name, but it's super long and I've never seen it done myself, and it's quite involved. You need like a really experienced operator to do that. So again, it really comes down to being intuitive about whether you feel these issues, what's in your diet, being a little bit of a detective, determining whether you are actually having ultra processed foods in your diet, cleaning those out, and then optimizing your environment. And the other thing actually that I didn't mention is stress. Stress is a real big issue when it comes to leaky gut. No one talks about that. So they did these studies where they use one of these tests that isn't 100% accurate. They made them do public speaking, which is quote unquote the stressful event, and they monitored their gut, and they found that their guts became leakier, quote unquote, when they had to do something stressful. So if you think about the modern day environment where we're hyper stressed, we're always on the go, we're eating all the time, we've got ultra processed foods, we're drinking too much alcohol, we don't have that much fiber in our diets, it's a storm of all these different factors that can lead to leakiness.
Understood. For the last part, I would want to focus on the optimization aspect. The optimization aspect that people they think about, what can I take or add to what I'm doing right now to make it better? And one of the things that I want to hear, what is your opinion on probiotics? And I understand it's most likely it's personalized for most, but on a general rule of thumb, is it something I shouldn't even like? At what point in my stack or health optimization routine is it position 42, or is it actually like 8 that I'm thinking about probiotics?
It's a very good question. In my personal list, it's really low down.
Okay.
And the reason why is because probiotics, there, there's this, it's so complicated. So me and you could take the same probiotic and have the entirely opposite effects. It could be amazing for you. It could be do absolutely nothing for me. And it all comes down to what environment are you introducing that probiotic into. Your gut is going to look very, very different to my gut as a result of, I mean, you're based in Dubai right now. I'm based in London. You've probably got slightly less pollution than me. I've got a 10-month-old, so I'm not sleeping great. Your sleep is probably going to be optimized. There's a whole bunch of different issues that lead to a varying response to the same input, in this case, a probiotic. The other thing is that these strains are really not that well studied because of the issues that I've just mentioned. The fact that you can give a strain in an RCT, a randomized controlled trial, to a whole bunch of different people, and they're not even measuring what their microbiomes look like before they give them the probiotic strain. That's like super frustrating. It's kind of like the vitamin D studies where they give them vitamin D and they haven't measured their pre-existing vitamin D baseline. Yeah, it's super frustrating. So, but that being said, I don't doubt that probiotics are going to have a benefit on certain people. We know that there is a list that was compiled by the World Journal of Gastroenterology, and they looked at specific probiotic strains, and they demonstrated that for certain people with IBS, certain types of IBS, women's health issues like bacterial vaginosis, immune issues, traveler's diarrhea, there is some indication that specific strains of probiotics are useful in those contexts. As a general, nice to have every single day, doesn't really appear to be that much evidence. So I would say, look, if you're going to explore it, try it. I don't think you're going to come to much harm, if I'm being wholly honest. It's very hard for a probiotic to attach itself to a community and actually embed itself in that pre-existing community in the first place. So the likelihood it's going to do harm is probably low, but I'm saying that with absolutely no evidence whatsoever. So that's why it's lower down my list, because I can't prove to myself that it's worth the investment.
Let's go higher up your list. And you mentioned prior omega-3. If we look in the supplement space, vitamins or supplements, what is in that list that you, from a baseline perspective, and I'm glad you mentioned the baseline perspective. Again, I've been in the supplement space for 8 years now. We don't know a single company that does the baseline prior to prescribing or giving people what they need on a regular basis. That's why we created Bionic in the first place, because we were like, we want to know if it actually works. So I'm very, very happy that we're looking at the things the same way. But what are some of the supplementation besides omega-3 that you think should be higher on the list for people to intake?
Oh, yeah. So vitamin D3 plus K2, I think, is a no-brainer for most people. Again, I would test your levels pre and post. I would say an optimum level is above 50. You don't want to go above 80 or 90. There is a real thing with vitamin D toxicity that people should be aware of. But most people, because we operate inside, I've got darker skin, so I'm less likely to convert naturally via the sun. It is like a no-brainer. So I definitely get it tested and definitely supplement with K2, which is Monoquin 7. That's the K2 that you want. I would say creatine monohydrate. I'm super impressed with the level of studies and coverage, the safety profile. There's potentially brain benefits as well. I personally take around 15 grams, but I'm experimenting with going up to 20 grams because, like I mentioned, I've got a 10-month-old. So if there are some scanty benefits of brain protection, then I'm all in for it. It doesn't matter. And my GI system can tolerate creatine.
Let me jump in here real quick on creatine. There's
Yeah.
a couple of things. I've love it. I love it. And it's fascinating how the last 6 months kind of feels like creatine got this new revival.
Yeah.
But it's not just for muscle building; it's also cognitive function. Then for women, women needed too. Actually, they needed more because they absorb. And now I get to the point. So I'm also at 15 grams per day. The one thing that I opened up myself was because I read about it that if you have bad sleep or you had a night out where you consumed a little bit too much, you take the double dosage of creatine. It actually helps you
Yeah.
to restore and get back on your feet. So I've done that on red-eye flights, and I can tell you it really works.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's a really good point because when I was traveling to LA this summer, we stayed there for a month, and I was traveling with my kid, and we were like super sleep deprived, and I took a double dose of creatine as well. I think it was like 25 grams for a few days, and I definitely felt better than I would have. Whether that's because I was like going to LA and it was all nice and sunny and it was new and I was like stimulating in a good way. I don't know, but like at least anecdotally, I think it worked for me. So yeah, so that's creatine. I would say the as well as omega 3, and I take quite a high dose of omega 3. I take 2 grams of EPA and DHA every single day. I think that's clinically therapeutic for me. There is a higher dose as well that is actually used within cardiology, which is 4 grams plus. But I don't think you need to go that high if your omega 3 index is in range. Um, I'm also taking NAC at the moment, which is nicotinamide.
For liver.
It's an Yeah, it's an interest. Sorry, N-acetylcysteine. It's an interesting one for me because I recently had pesticide reports done whilst I was in LA, and it turns out that I'm harboring a few pesticides, and so I'm taking NAC in the hope that it will help excrete some of those and just give my liver a little bit of a boost. But that's sort of experimental for me at the moment. The other thing I would say for people who struggle to get protein into their diet every day, I would say a good quality protein supplement could be useful. So I use a plant-based one that's a blend of pumpkin seed, rice, and something else, which gives a really good amino acid profile. Every now and then, I will take an organic whey, but I sit better with the plant based one. And again, it's lab tested to be free of things like arsenic and other heavy metals. So I do take that. But honestly, otherwise, it's a real whole food approach I take. So broccoli sprouts, moringa. I take turmeric in its whole form. I take cacao again from like an area that's sourcing cacao beans that are low in heavy metals, and I take that in a drink.
How about
Most of mine.
How about caffeine?
Say that again.
Caffeine?
Caffeine. Oh yeah, yeah. So I mean, yeah, I'm chief science officer for a coffee company, so I'm definitely taking
You
a
do.
good yeah, yeah. So
Twice a
XL
day.
coffee is it's yeah, at least 2 cups a day. But interestingly, I don't know if you've experimented with this, but I go caffeine free for 30 days every year, where I will switch to decaf. So we have a mountain water process decaf that's a much gentler process of decaffeination that doesn't use any harsh solvents and maintains a lot of the polyphenols that actually give the benefits to coffee in the first place. So even when you take caffeine out of coffee, there are still benefits to your brain and metabolic health and type 2 diabetes. So we have a coffee, XL coffee, that's like super high in polyphenols, like 600 milligrams plus, whereas high street coffee might have as low as 6 milligrams. We lab test it and all the rest of it. But I go off caffeine for 30 days every single year just to sort of like reset my tolerance to caffeine, which I think is really important because it is it's a psychoactive drug at the end of the day. And then when I have that first coffee at the end of 30 days, honestly, it feels like rocket fuel and it's great. So I get a lot of work done on that day. But I like to do that just to sort of cycle any stimulants so as to reduce tolerance and sort of the dependency on it.
Yeah, restart your receptors.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
The one thing that, so obviously we have the GLP-1s and the GLP-2s and
Yeah.
GLP-3s and GLP-5s, but there's statements out there that the original GLP-1 is olive oil, virgin olive oil. Is there something to it? Number one. So what's the natural competitor to GLP-1s? And then what is actually your stance on the tirzepatides and the reticulotides of the world?
Yeah. So the longest standing natural GLP-1 in the world that everyone is sleeping on is fiber. Okay.
Oh wow.
It
Okay.
is fiber. It is fiber.
I
So
had several answers in my head, but fiber was not one of them.
yeah. So why is fiber a natural GLP-1 agonist? Well, when you consume something, and it could be a high fiber vegetable, it could be something like chia that's like soaked and like forms the gel. It could be psyllium husk. It could be flaxseed. What it does is it encourages those incretin hormones to be produced, and that signals to your brain that you're experiencing satiety. These are very well recognized as being GLP-1 boosters, which is actually why in the States you've got a product that is calling itself a GLP-1 booster, and it's just like chicory root and inulin and some other prebiotics. So these prebiotics are really really powerful, and it's one of the ways I think people should really investigate, and like by whole food plant-based diet, but if you want to supplement with some of these extra things they think are useful, like psyllium husk and flaxseed, that I'm really really bullish on. Like these are natural GLP-1 agonists. Olive oil is fantastic. Vitamin E, oleopene, oleocanthal, anti-inflammatory products been shown in a number of different studies to be as effective for pain relief as ibuprofen. Not that we want to equate the two, but
Yep.
like super, super impressive. Cardiovascular benefits is great. Would I use it in place of something like tirzepatide or, semaglutide? I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say that they're equivalent at all. When you're taking these drugs, you're taking a really high dose of something that is giving you super physiologic doses of GLP-1. So this isn't like anything that you could call like a natural response. It's
Yep.
like a mega dose. And I think for certain people, it is absolutely life changing and absolutely game changing. And I would encourage people to use it in the way it's been intended, which is with a whole foods diet, with exercise, with muscle preserving protocols, because this is something that unfortunately will happen if your appetite is suddenly completely slashed. You're not going to be consuming enough protein. You're probably not going to be consuming the nutrients that you need to operate at 100%. So I think it's really important to be cognizant of that, and I think the overuse of it in people for whom it's not clinically indicated is something that we should all be really, really cautious of. Because, I mean, no one was talking about bariatric surgery in the same way because it's like, it's horrendous. You have the side effects and all the rest of it, but it literally cures type 2 diabetes the day after you have the surgery. So these drugs are as impressive as bariatric surgery, but the ease of access, I think, is leading to overconsumption, and that's something we need to be really, really cautious of. And also, I don't want to protect the pharma companies here. They're very, very responsible for the hype that it's getting as well.
Absolutely.
1 minute there's an article on how it protects your brain against dementia, and can add years to life, and it might be geroprotective. I think these are all like, it's hyperbole at the moment, and I haven't seen anything to suggest that it is a longevity agent. So I'd be really, really skeptical.
I think that's the point where we're coming back to food as medicine, and I think the part that we discussed about from what's the main things of intake, when you take it in, what you should not take in. So overall, thank you so much for your time, man. It was an absolute pleasure. Just for the audience, so they can find more about you, about the books, and about your content. Where can they find you?
Yeah, man. You can find the Doctor's Kitchen app on all the app stores. thedoctorskitchen.com is where you find out a bit more about me and listen to the podcast and watch some YouTube videos. If you're into food, we're doing a lot more on YouTube these days. We're like cooking and healthy, high protein meals and food on the go. And yeah, so you can find out more about us there.
Dr. Rupy, I appreciate it, man. Thank you for your time. It's an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, man. This has been great.